You know that feeling when something finds you at exactly the right moment? A sentence in a book you almost didn't open. A conversation you stumbled into on a day when you'd nearly canceled everything. Words that landed somewhere deeper than understanding, somewhere closer to recognition, as if the thing you were hearing had already been living inside you and was just waiting for someone to say it out loud. That's what this is. This isn't information arriving at a convenient time. This is a message that's been looking for you, and it found you here because here is exactly where you needed to be found. Maybe you don't feel ready for it. Maybe you're listening to this in the middle of something you can't quite name. A heaviness that doesn't match any obvious cause. A quietness that settled over your life like fog over a landscape you used to recognize. Everything looks the same from the outside, but from the inside, the signal has changed. Something is ending, or has already ended, and you haven't told anyone yet because you don't have the language for what's happening. You just know the life you've been living has started to feel like a coat that belongs to someone else. Carl Jung arrived at a moment like this in 1913. From the outside, his life was the portrait of professional success. He was one of the most respected minds in European psychiatry, the man Sigmund Freud himself had chosen as his intellectual heir. He had patience, prestige, a body of work that was already reshaping how people understood the human mind. And beneath all of it, something was pulling. Something had been pulling for months, maybe longer. A current running underneath the accomplished surface of his life, a voice he kept trying to drown out with more work, more writing, more of the identity he'd spent years constructing. Until one day, the current got strong enough that he couldn't ignore it anymore. What followed was a confrontation so destabilizing that Jung genuinely questioned whether he was losing his mind. He didn't go looking for his transformation. It found him, the way real messages always do, at the moment when the old chapter had quietly exhausted itself, and something inside him refused to keep pretending it hadn't. Today, I'm going to share something structured the way real messages are structured, in 3 parts. What's actually happening to you right now, and why it feels the way it does. What you need to hear before you cross the threshold into whatever's coming next, and what becomes possible on the other side if you can cross it without running back to what's already finished. This is for a specific kind of person, someone who isn't wondering whether change is coming, but who can already feel it in their body, in their sleep, in the growing distance between who they appear to be and who they actually are. If that's you, then this message was always going to reach you. The only question was when. Let's start with where you are, because where you are right now has a very specific texture, and almost nobody around you can feel it the way you can. There's a flatness to things. That's the word that keeps coming back, flat. The dinner you used to look forward to still happens, and you still sit at the table, and the food still tastes like food. But the aliveness that used to be woven through the experience has thinned to almost nothing. You eat, you clean up, you move to the next thing. The conversation with someone you genuinely care about unfolds the way it always has. The words are right, the rhythm is familiar, but there's a pane of glass between you and the moment that wasn't there before. You can see it all, you just can't quite touch it. And here's the part that makes this particular kind of flatness so disorienting. It doesn't match your circumstances. Your life, by most external measurements, might actually be fine. Maybe even good. You have things people spend decades chasing. You've built something that looks, from every reasonable angle, like it should be enough. And the gap between that fact and the hollow feeling underneath it creates a very specific kind of shame. Because how do you explain to anyone that the life you worked so hard to build doesn't feel like yours anymore? How do you say that out loud without sounding ungrateful or broken or like someone who doesn't appreciate what they have? So you don't say it. You carry it quietly. And the weight of carrying it quietly adds another layer to the heaviness that was already there. Then there's the thing that happens at 3 in the morning. You know the one. You're awake and you don't know why. And the room is dark, and whatever distractions carry you through the daylight hours aren't available anymore. Something surfaces in that silence, something that doesn't arrive as a thought. It arrives as a weight in the center of your chest, a knowing. Something is ending, something is waiting, and you can't tell whether what you're feeling is dread or relief, because honestly, it might be both at the same time. You lie there with it, and you don't tell anyone about it in the morning, and by lunch you've almost convinced yourself it was nothing. But it comes back the next night, and the next, because it isn't nothing. It's the truest thing you've felt in months. The people around you are seeing something too. They're seeing you pull back, get quieter, cancel plans you would have kept 6 months ago. They watch you drift to the edges of conversations you used to anchor, and they're interpreting what they see through the only frameworks they have. Maybe you're stressed, maybe you need a break, maybe something happened that you're not talking about. What they can't see, because it's invisible from the outside, is that the pulling back is something your whole system is doing on purpose. The quiet isn't withdrawal. It's the sound of something reorganizing beneath the surface, redirecting energy from the life you've been performing towards something you can't see yet. The message that's been arriving in pieces, through the flatness, through the 3 a.m. wait, through the growing distance between your outside and your inside, is telling you something very simple. The old chapter is done, whether you're ready for that or not. And this is where the loneliness of it sharpens, because the people who love you are misreading what's happening. They're misreading it with the best of intentions, which almost makes it harder. Your mother notices you've been distant and suggests you talk to someone. Your friend sees the change in your energy and recommends a vacation, a reset, something to get you back to yourself. Your partner keeps asking what's wrong, and you keep saying nothing, because the truth, that you're becoming someone neither of you has met yet, isn't a sentence you know how to say in the middle of a Tuesday. These people love you, their concern is real, and their suggestions come from a framework that treats what you're going through as a problem to be solved. Identify the issue, apply the fix, restore normal functioning. That framework works beautifully for 100 different kinds of difficulty. It works for burnout, for grief, for situational depression, for the ordinary struggles of a life lived under pressure. But what's happening to you isn't ordinary. Jung spent his entire career trying to articulate the difference between a psychological problem and a psychological transformation, and the difference matters enormously here. A problem is something that went wrong and needs to be corrected. A transformation is something that went right, at the deepest level, and is demanding that everything else catch up. The culture you live in doesn't have a category for this distinction. It has one framework for discomfort: crisis. And crisis has a protocol. Find the cause, treat the symptoms, return the person to baseline. Every institution you might turn to, medicine, therapy, well-meaning friends, the internet, is oriented toward getting you back to how you were before. Back to normal, back to functional, back to the version of you that fit comfortably into the structures you'd built around yourself. And if what's happening to you were actually a crisis, that protocol would be exactly right. The issue is that it isn't a crisis. It's a dismantling that your own psyche initiated because the structures you built, as impressive as they are, became too small to hold what's trying to grow inside them. The hardest misreading, though, isn't the one coming from other people. It's the one you're doing to yourself, because you've absorbed the same frameworks everyone around you uses. You know what a healthy, well-adjusted person looks like: productive, engaged, clear about their direction, emotionally stable, able to show up consistently for the people and commitments in their life. And you know that you don't look like that right now. So the conclusion feels obvious. Something is wrong with you. You're failing at a life you should be grateful for. You're falling apart when you should be holding it together. You're becoming difficult, distant, unreliable. All the things the performed version of you was specifically designed never to be. Jung would have sat with you in that self-judgment and said something that might have been hard to hear. He would have told you that the performed version, the one you built piece by piece from childhood onward, the one that learned exactly how to behave to earn love, avoid conflict, meet expectations, had a lifespan. It was designed for specific conditions. It was built to navigate the family you grew up in, to survive the dynamics that shaped your earliest understanding of who you needed to be in order to belong. And it worked. That's the thing people miss when they talk about masks and personas. The mask wasn't a mistake. It was brilliant. It was exactly the right tool for the job it was built to do, and it kept you safe during years when you needed that safety more than you needed authenticity. But tools built for one set of conditions become obstacles in new ones. The persona that helped you survive your childhood became the thing structuring your adult relationships. The performance that earned your parents' approval became the template for how you showed up at work, in friendships, in love. And at some point, and Jung saw this happen with such consistency that he came to expect it, the life force starts pulling back from the mask. The energy that used to flow into maintaining the performance begins to withdraw, the way sap retreats from branches when the season turns. The branches don't snap, they just go dry. And the energy that used to sustain them pools somewhere deeper, somewhere you can't access yet, gathering itself for something you can't see. That withdrawal is the flatness, the signal dropping from your routines, your goals, your relationships. It isn't a malfunction in your ability to enjoy your life. It's your psyche redirecting resources away from the performed self because the performed self has done its work, and the psyche is ready to invest in something more real. It feels like loss because something is being lost. The comfortable familiarity of knowing exactly who you're supposed to be in every room you walk into. The ease of a role so practiced that you could play it in your sleep. You've been playing it in your sleep, actually. That's part of what's ending. Jung had a term he borrowed from the alchemists, enantiodromia. It describes the tendency of things to turn into their opposite at the moment of their greatest intensity. The life that looks most complete from the outside is frequently the one that's most exhausted on the inside. The person who seems most together is often the one whose internal structures are under the most strain. The moment when the performance reaches its peak, when you finally achieved the thing, built the life, earned the recognition, is so often the exact moment when something beneath the surface says, quietly and without drama, "Enough. I'm done. Whatever comes next, it has to be real." This is the message your psyche has been sending, through the flatness, through the 3 a.m. wait, through the distance growing between your performed self and your actual one. It hasn't been sending it to punish you or because something went wrong. It's been sending it because something inside you has outgrown the container you built for it, and the container can't stretch any further. The ache you've been carrying, the one you couldn't find language for until just now, that ache is the message arriving. And what it's telling you, with the kind of patient insistence that only the deepest part of you can sustain, is that the old chapter has completed itself. The story you've been living has reached its natural conclusion. And what comes next requires something the old story never asked of you: the willingness to stop performing long enough to find out who you actually are when nobody's watching, when no role is required, when the only person you have to be is the one you've been avoiding for years. Which brings us to the part of this message that carries the most weight. Because understanding what's happening, recognizing the flatness, naming the withdrawal, seeing the persona for what it was, that's the first step. But the message doesn't stop at recognition. It has specific things to tell you about this threshold, about what it requires, about the particular costs and particular freedoms that come with actually crossing it, instead of standing at its edge forever, waiting for someone to tell you it's safe. So now you know what's happening. You can feel the contours of it, the flatness, the withdrawal, the quiet broadcast coming from somewhere beneath the life you built. The question shifts. It has to. Because understanding what's happening and hearing what it's telling you are two entirely different things, and most people stall in the space between them. They get the diagnosis but never open the prescription. They recognize the signal but never decode the actual content. What the message carries, the one that's been arriving piece by piece through all of this, is specific. Jung would have been insistent about that. The psyche doesn't communicate in generalities. It communicates in precise, sometimes brutal, sometimes tender truths calibrated to exactly where you are. And where you are right now, standing at this particular threshold, there are 5 things the message needs you to hear. Some of them will feel like relief. Some of them will feel like a hand pressing on a bruise you forgot was there. All of them are pointed in the same direction, toward the crossing you've been circling without committing to. Here's the first thing, and it's the one that lands hardest. The old chapter is already over. It didn't end with a phone call or a fight or a single dramatic moment you can point to and say, that's when everything changed. It ended the way most real endings happen, slowly, almost silently, like a tide pulling back so gradually you didn't notice the water was gone until you looked down and saw dry sand where the ocean used to be. The life you've been showing up to, the routines you've been maintaining, the version of yourself you've been presenting, you've been walking through the motions of a story that finished writing itself months ago, maybe longer, and you know this. Somewhere underneath the effort to keep things running, you know. You can feel the specific exhaustion of trying to animate something that's gone still. It's different from the tiredness of hard work or the fatigue of a bad season. It's the bone-deep weariness of performing CPR on a chapter that has already taken its last breath. You keep pushing because stopping would mean admitting what stopped, and admitting what stopped would mean facing the emptiness on the other side of it. Jung watched people spend years in exactly this place, technically still living the old life, functionally already finished with it, burning massive amounts of psychic energy to maintain the illusion that what was done could still be revived. He compared it to someone tending a garden in winter, watering frozen soil, wondering why nothing grows. The soil isn't broken, the season has turned, and no amount of effort can reverse a season. There was a woman, a composite drawn from several of Jung's observations, who kept redecorating her house long after she'd decided to leave. New curtains, fresh paint in the bedroom, a reorganized kitchen. She wasn't delusional, she knew she was leaving. But the act of improving the house she was about to walk away from gave her something to do with her hands while the rest of her caught up to what her gut already knew. The house didn't need new curtains. She needed one honest moment of standing in the doorway and acknowledging she was already gone. That's what this first piece of the message is asking of you. Not a dramatic gesture, not a bonfire of everything you've built. Just the quiet, private acknowledgement that the chapter you keep tending has already closed. The energy you're spending to maintain it, to show up, to perform, to keep the machinery running. That energy belongs to what's coming next, and it can't flow there while you're still pouring it into something that's finished. Here's the second thing. What you're grieving right now is real, and feeling it doesn't make you fragile. There's a specific kind of loss that comes with outgrowing a life you actually built, the kind that doesn't come with a villain or a catastrophe, just the slow recognition that something you poured years into has reached its natural limit. You didn't fail it. It didn't fail you. It just ended. The way things end when they've given everything they were designed to give. And the grief of that is different from the grief of something being taken from you. It's the grief of something completing, of a chapter that was real and meaningful arriving at its last page. The relationship that actually did sustain you for a time. The career that genuinely did teach you things you needed to learn. The identity that carried you through seasons you couldn't have survived without it. These things mattered. They were real. Letting them go doesn't erase what they gave you, but it also doesn't change the fact that holding on to them past their expiration requires you to shrink back into someone you've already outgrown. Jung understood this particular grief better than most therapists of his era, partly because he'd lived through it himself. When he separated from Freud, professionally, intellectually, personally, he lost more than a mentor. He lost an entire framework for understanding his own life. The Freudian world had been his home, his identity, his professional family. Walking away from it meant walking into a period where he had no system, no map, no community of people who saw the world the way he was beginning to see it. And he grieved that loss deeply, even though he knew the leaving was necessary, even though staying would have required him to amputate parts of his own thinking to fit inside Freud's framework. What he learned from his own grief, and then confirmed across decades of watching others go through it. You can honor what something gave you and still let it go. Those two things don't cancel each other out. The mistake isn't in feeling the grief. The mistake is in believing the grief is a signal to go back. Grief at the threshold isn't the psyche telling you that you've made a wrong turn. It's the psyche completing its relationship with what came before, so that your hands are free for what comes next. The only time grief becomes a cage is when it transforms from something you're moving through into something you're living inside. When the mourning itself becomes a substitute for the forward motion that the mourning was supposed to make possible. And if you're honest with yourself, you probably know the difference between those two things. You can feel when the sadness is processing and when it's hiding, when it's doing its necessary work, and when it's become the last acceptable reason to stay exactly where you are. Here's the third thing the message carries, and this is the one that most people try to negotiate their way around. Some of the people you love are calibrated to a version of you that's disappearing, and as that version dissolves, those relationships are going to shift in ways you can't control and might not be able to repair. Not because anyone did anything wrong, because the connection was built on a foundation that's no longer there. The persona you maintained, the role you played, the specific shape you held so that the relationship could function the way both of you needed it to. Think about someone in your life who gets uncomfortable when you're honest about what you're feeling. Not angry necessarily, just uneasy. They shift the subject. They offer quick solutions. They remind you of how good things are, how much you have, how many people would love to be in your position. And you can feel every time this happens, the gentle pressure to return to the version of yourself they're comfortable with, the one who holds it together, the one who doesn't need too much, the one who keeps the emotional temperature of the room at a level everyone can manage. That pressure isn't malicious. In most cases, the people exerting it don't even know they're doing it. They built their experience of you around the persona. They learned to rely on you being a certain way, steady, accommodating, available, uncomplicated. When you stop being those things, their world gets less predictable. And their response, the subtle pulling, the confusion, the withdrawal, or the pushback, is their nervous system trying to restore the equilibrium that your changing has disrupted. Jung was specific about this dynamic. He observed that the relational system surrounding any individual is calibrated to that individual's persona. When the persona shifts, the system experiences it as a threat, and the system will attempt to pull the person back into their old configuration, not through force usually, but through emotional pressure, through guilt, through the quiet withdrawal of affection until the person returns to the shape the system recognizes. The people who can walk with you into the next chapter are the ones who can tolerate the discomfort of not recognizing you for a while, who can hold the uncertainty of watching you become someone they haven't met yet without panicking, without interpreting it as abandonment, without requiring you to slow down or explain or perform familiarity for their comfort. And you'll recognize them by how they respond to the real you, the one who shows up without the mask, without the role, without the careful management of how you're perceived. Some people will lean in, some people will back away. Both responses tell you something true about the nature of the connection, and neither one needs to be forced into a different shape. What hurts about this? What Jung acknowledged was one of the most painful aspects of genuine individuation, is that you can't always predict who falls into which category. Sometimes, the person you expected to stay is the one who can't handle who you're becoming. Sometimes, the person you barely noticed before turns out to be the one who sees you most clearly in your new form. The reorganization of your relational world during this period is real, and it is unpredictable, and controlling it is not something the threshold offers you. Loving someone and growing beyond the dynamic you shared with them, both of those things can be true at the same time. Jung would have said they almost always are, and if that's where you find yourself right now, holding the weight of connections that are shifting while the ground under your own feet hasn't settled yet, there's something that might help you stay oriented through it. We put together a guide called True Self-Discovery, 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's own framework, built for exactly this territory. The place where you're still in motion, still between who you were and who you're becoming, and need something that helps you hear your own voice through the noise of everyone else's reactions to your changing. Click below if that speaks to where you are, and then stay with me, because there are 2 more pieces of this message, and they matter. Here's the 4th thing, and this is where the message stops being gentle. There are things you're still doing, habits of self-management, strategies for keeping the peace, patterns you've carried so long they feel like personality rather than protection, that are actively preventing the crossing. They served you in the old chapter. They kept you safe, kept you connected, kept the system functioning. And now they're the chains you keep mistaking for limbs. The first one is over-explaining yourself. You've been doing it for weeks, maybe months, justifying the changes, narrating the transformation, making sure everyone around you has context for why you're different now. And it's exhausting, partly because the explanation never lands the way you need it to, partly because the people who would understand don't need the explanation, and the people who need the explanation aren't in a position to understand. Jung noticed that people at the threshold often spend more energy translating their experience for others than they spend actually living it. The translation becomes a way to stay connected to the old world while inching toward the new one, and it splits your attention right at the moment when your attention needs to be whole. The second one is the reflexive apology for your own becoming. You probably don't even hear yourself doing it anymore. The small concessions, the pulling back, the moments where you soften something true into something palatable because the full truth would make someone uncomfortable. You catch yourself doing it mid-sentence, starting to say what you actually mean and then sanding the edges off because the old programming kicks in and reminds you that making people uncomfortable is the same as being cruel. It isn't, but the persona was built on that equation, and the persona's math is hard to unlearn even after you've seen through it. Every time you apologize for your own growth, every time you make yourself smaller to fit back into a space you've already outgrown, you send a signal to your own psyche that the crossing isn't safe, that becoming who you are will be punished, that the real you is something that needs to be managed rather than expressed. And the psyche listens. It takes your cues. If you keep telling it that authenticity is dangerous, it will slow the transformation to a crawl, because the psyche won't push you into something you keep demonstrating you're unwilling to receive. The third one, and this is the subtlest, you're waiting for permission. From a therapist, from a partner, from a friend whose opinion you trust, from some sign or synchronicity that confirms the direction you're already being pulled in. You want someone, anyone, to look at what you're going through and say, yes, this is real. Yes, you should keep going. Yes, the thing you're sensing is worth following. And the waiting feels reasonable because the stakes are high and the visibility is low, and you've been trained since childhood to check your perceptions against someone else's before trusting them. But the permission you're waiting for is the one thing the threshold will never give you from the outside. Jung was direct about this. Individuation, becoming who you actually are, is by definition a solitary authorization. No one else can validate the necessity of your becoming because no one else is inside the experience of it. They can witness it, they can support it, but they can't confirm it. The confirmation has to come from the same place the transformation is coming from, somewhere inside you that knows what it knows, even when every external signal suggests you should sit down, be quiet, and go back to the version of yourself that didn't cause this much disruption. There's a fourth pattern worth naming, the insistence on understanding the full picture before taking a single step. You want to see the new chapter clearly before you commit to leaving the old one. You want the plan, the trajectory, the reassurance that what's on the other side justifies what it costs to get there. And Jung would have told you that this is the ego's final negotiating tactic, the demand for certainty as a prerequisite for movement. Because the ego knows that if you wait for certainty, you'll wait forever. Certainty doesn't precede the crossing, it follows it. The clarity you're hoping for is only available on the other side of the movement you're delaying. Here's the fifth thing, and this is where the message changes temperature entirely. Everything you've been going through, the dissolution, the grief, the relational reorganization, the slow death of the person you used to perform, has a direction. It's been easy to miss the direction because the process looks so much like destruction. When you're watching your old identity come apart, when the things that used to define you are losing their hold, when the future you imagined for yourself evaporates, what you're experiencing feels formless and random, like the losses are piling up without purpose, like the universe is subtracting from your life without any plan to add something back. Jung spent years arguing against this interpretation, in his writing and in his consulting room. He kept returning to the same observation. The psyche doesn't dismantle at random. What gets dissolved is what can't be carried into the next phase. What falls away is what would have been too heavy, too rigid, too small for what's coming. The losses are precise, they're specific, and they correspond exactly to the capacities the new chapter is going to require. The person who lost the career built on external validation is being prepared to build something that comes from internal authority. The person whose relationships are shifting is being freed from connections that required performance and cleared for connections that can hold authenticity. The person who can no longer maintain the mask is being readied to live in their actual face, which means encountering themselves without the buffer of a character they've been playing since they were old enough to understand that certain parts of them were welcome and other parts were supposed to stay hidden. The message finds you here, at this specific intersection, because this is where the direction becomes visible if you're willing to look at it. Everything that's falling away is falling in the same direction, away from the constructed, away from the inherited, away from the performed, and towards something you can probably feel but can't yet name. A way of being in the world that doesn't require you to abandon yourself every morning just to make it through the day. Jung described the moment when someone at the threshold first senses this direction as one of the most important moments in the entire individuation process. Because up until that point, the transformation feels like something happening to you, something you're enduring, something you didn't choose and can't control. But the moment you sense the direction, the moment you realize the losses aren't random, that the dismantling has a logic, that the pain is pointed somewhere, the transformation shifts from something you're surviving into something you're participating in. And that shift changes everything about how you carry the weight of it. The best chapter of your life doesn't begin when conditions are perfect. It begins when you become someone who no longer needs conditions to be perfect in order to start living honestly. And everything you've been going through, every loss, every grief, every uncomfortable conversation, every night spent staring at the ceiling wondering who you're turning into, has been building that someone, quietly, beneath the noise, in the only place real change ever happens, which is underneath the story you've been telling yourself about who you are. There's still the crossing itself, the actual movement from standing at the threshold to stepping through it. And that part, the mechanics of it, the surrender it requires, and what Jung discovered about the people who made it through without turning back, is where we go next. So now you know what the message says. You've heard the 5 transmissions, the old chapter being over, the grief being real, the people who can't follow, the behaviors being asked to stop, and the preparation underneath all of it. And knowing these things is important, but knowing them isn't the crossing. Knowing them is standing at the edge with clearer eyes. The crossing itself requires something else entirely, something Jung spent decades trying to understand, because he kept watching people arrive at exactly this point. Fully aware, fully oriented, able to articulate everything that was happening to them with perfect clarity, and then stay right where they were, aware and frozen, understood and unmoved. He wanted to know what separated the people who crossed from the ones who didn't. What he found surprised him, because the difference had nothing to do with what he expected. He expected it to be courage. It wasn't. Some of the most courageous people he worked with, people who had survived extraordinary difficulty, who had endured things that would have shattered others, couldn't make the crossing. They could fight, they could endure, they could white-knuckle their way through almost anything. But the threshold didn't respond to any of that. It didn't require them to fight harder or endure more. It required something their entire survival system had been built to prevent. It required surrender. And before that word gets absorbed into whatever meaning it's accumulated from 1,000 self-help books and spiritual retreats, Jung meant something very specific by it. He didn't mean giving up. He didn't mean passive acceptance or spiritual resignation, or the kind of vague, comfortable letting go that gets printed on candles. He meant the willingness to stop negotiating with the transformation, to stop trying to control how it happens, when it happens, what it costs, and what it looks like from the outside. To stop running the process through the ego's project management system and let it move at its own speed, in its own direction, according to its own intelligence. The people who crossed were the ones who could do that. They couldn't necessarily explain what they were doing, and it didn't look impressive from the outside. It looked, honestly, like someone who had just gotten tired of fighting the current and decided to let the river carry them. There was something almost ordinary about it, a quieting, a settling, the moment when the clenched fist of the ego simply opened, not because it was defeated, but because it finally understood that what it was trying to hold on to had already left. Jung connected this to what he called the transcendent function, one of his most important and least understood concepts. When a person can hold the tension between who they were and who they're becoming, without collapsing into either side, something activates in the psyche that neither the conscious mind nor the unconscious could produce on its own. A third position emerges, something new, something that carries the lessons of the old chapter without being imprisoned by them, and that moves toward the new chapter without needing to have it fully mapped before taking the first step. The transcendent function can't be forced. Jung was emphatic about that. You can't manufacture it through effort or willpower or sheer determination. Those are all ego tools, and the transcendent function operates precisely in the space where ego tools stop working. What you can do is create the conditions for it, and those conditions are surprisingly simple, even if they're brutally difficult to maintain. You hold the tension, you stay in the not knowing, you resist the urge to resolve the ambiguity prematurely, by going back, by leaping forward, by grabbing the first available identity that will make the emptiness stop. You sit in the gap between chapters with your hands open instead of grasping, and you wait. You wait the way someone waits who knows something is coming but doesn't know when, and has decided to trust that the timing isn't theirs to control. The people Jung watched complete this crossing didn't have more clarity than the ones who retreated. They didn't have better support systems or easier circumstances or some special psychological advantage. What they had was a higher tolerance for ambiguity. They could stand in the uncertain space longer without breaking. They could feel the full weight of not knowing who they were becoming and stay on their feet. They could hear the voice that said, "Go back, this was a mistake, you were fine before," and let it speak without obeying it. If you had to paint a portrait of someone at the moment of crossing, it wouldn't look dramatic. It would look like someone sitting quietly with their eyes open. Someone who has stopped explaining, stopped apologizing, stopped trying to make it make sense to anyone else. Someone whose face holds the particular calm of a person who has run out of strategies and discovered that beneath the strategies, there's still ground to stand on. That's what the crossing looks like from the inside. Ordinary, quiet, the kind of moment that changes everything without anyone noticing it happened. But before that moment arrives, there are things that need to be put down, specific things. Jung was precise about this. He didn't talk in generalities about letting go as though it were one unified action. He identified distinct attachments that people carry all the way to the edge of the threshold, clutching them like luggage they've convinced themselves they can't travel without. And these attachments are the last barriers between where the listener is standing and where they're going. The first is the need for the transition to be understood by the people around you. This is one of the last things to go, and it clings harder than almost anything else, because it's rooted in something real, the desire to be known, to be seen accurately, to have the people you love understand the significance of what's happening to you. You've been carrying a quiet hope that someone, your partner, your parent, your closest friend, will eventually see it, will look at you and say, "I understand. I can see that something real is happening and I'm with you." And maybe some of them will eventually. But the crossing can't wait for that. Because the truth is, most people in your life are interpreting your transformation through the lens of their own unexamined psychology, and they're going to keep doing that regardless of how clearly you try to explain yourself. Their misreading of you isn't malice, it's limitation. And waiting for them to overcome that limitation before you allow yourself to move is a way of giving them veto power over your becoming. Putting this down doesn't mean you stop caring what people think. It means you stop requiring their comprehension as a prerequisite for your next step. The second thing that needs to be released is the alternate timeline. You know the one. The version of the story where all of this happens without costing what it's actually costing. where the transformation arrives clean and painless, where you get the new chapter without the relational disruption, without the professional uncertainty, without the long stretch of standing in the dark not knowing if the light is coming or if you've just walked into a wall. Your mind built that timeline at the threshold as a negotiation tactic. It's the ego's last counteroffer. What if we could do this differently? What if there's a version where everybody's okay and nothing has to be lost, and the change happens on a schedule that feels manageable? It's a beautiful fiction, and it needs to be mourned and released, because every hour you spend inside that alternate timeline is an hour you're not spending in the actual one. The messy, costly, real one that's the only path that leads somewhere. The third thing is the old definition of safety. This one runs deep, deeper than the other two because it's been with you longer. In the old chapter, safety meant predictability. It meant knowing the rules, knowing your role, knowing what was expected and how to deliver it. It meant legibility, the comfort of being someone others could categorize and understand. It meant a specific kind of stability that came from the outside in. Stable job, stable relationship, stable identity. The external structures were solid, and that solidity felt like safety. The new chapter's version of safety works completely differently. It comes from the inside out. It's rooted in your relationship with yourself, your capacity to trust your own judgment, your own values, your own reading of what's real. The external structures might shift, might reorganize, might look uncertain from any angle, but the internal center holds, and that holding is where the new safety lives. This shift in where safety is located, from external scaffolding to internal ground, is one of the most disorienting parts of the crossing. Because the old safety was tangible, you could point to it, you could measure it. The new safety is felt, intuited, experienced from within, and there's no way to prove to anyone else that it's real. You just know. The way you know certain things at 3 in the morning that evaporate under the scrutiny of daylight logic, but are no less true for it. Jung noticed something consistent about the moment after these 3 things are released. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that lifts. He described it in various ways across his writing, but the essence was always the same. The energy that was going into maintaining what's finished, into holding open the door to a room you've already left, into keeping alive a version of yourself that's already gone. That energy suddenly becomes available. And people consistently describe this moment as a kind of physical sensation, like putting down a bag you'd been carrying so long you'd forgotten it had weight. The relief isn't euphoric, it's quiet. It's the specific lightness of a body that has stopped bracing against something that already happened. And here's where the crossing itself becomes something you can actually talk about without mystifying it. Because one of the things that keeps people at the threshold longer than necessary is the expectation that the crossing will feel monumental, that there will be a clear before and after, a sensation of arrival, a dramatic inner shift they can point to and say, "There, that's when I crossed." Jung observed something far less cinematic. The crossing, almost every time he witnessed it, happened quietly. It looked like a single decision, often small, often unremarkable to anyone watching from the outside. A conversation where someone said the true thing instead of the managed thing. A morning where someone woke up and moved in the direction of what felt right instead of what felt expected. A moment where the old performance was available. The mask was right there, ready to be put back on, and the person simply didn't reach for it. That's the crossing. That's how it actually happens. One honest choice made from the real self instead of the performed one, and then another, and then another. Each one so small it barely registers as significant. Each one, taken together, forming the first steps of a life built on a foundation the old chapter never had. The message that's been finding you, through the flatness and the 3 a.m. wait and the quiet knowing that something is over, it's been preparing you for exactly this. For the small, honest step. For the unremarkable moment when you choose to be real, when performing would be easier and safer and far more comfortable. The crossing doesn't announce itself. It just happens, in the gap between one breath and the next, when you stop waiting to be ready and simply begin. And what begins, what Jung saw consistently emerge on the other side of genuine transformation, wasn't a shinier version of the old life. It was a different quality of being alive altogether. The people who completed the crossing stopped living in the gap between who they were and who they were performing. And that gap, it turns out, had been consuming an extraordinary amount of energy. Years of it, decades in some cases. The constant calibration of how to present, what to reveal, what to hide, how to modulate yourself for each room and each relationship. All of that psychic labor simply stopped being necessary, and the energy that became available felt, to many of Jung's patients, like something they hadn't experienced since childhood. An aliveness, a directness of contact with their own experience that the persona had been filtering out for as long as they could remember. Their relationship with uncertainty changed in a way that would have been impossible to explain to them while they were still on the other side of the crossing. They stopped needing to know what was coming, not because they'd become reckless or indifferent to their own future, but because they'd discovered something during the threshold that couldn't be undiscovered. They could trust their own reading of things, their own values, their own instincts about what was real and what was performance. The compass had moved from external to internal. Uncertainty didn't become comfortable, Jung never claimed that, but it became navigable. They could stand inside it without drowning. Their relationships changed too, in ways that were sometimes painful and sometimes astonishing. Jung observed that people who had genuinely crossed formed different kinds of connections, less dependent on being seen in a particular way, less organized around need, and more organized around actual presence. There was a paradox in it that Jung returned to again and again across his later work. Becoming more fully yourself makes you more genuinely available to others. The persona, which was supposed to facilitate connection, had actually been blocking it. It had been inserting a performance between you and every person you interacted with, filtering everything through the question of how you were being perceived. Remove the performance, and suddenly you can actually see the person in front of you, and they can actually see you. But here's something that matters, and it would be dishonest to leave it out. The best chapter of your life doesn't arrive without difficulty. It arrives with different difficulty. The specific ache of living inauthentically lifts. The exhaustion of maintaining the mask lifts. The particular loneliness of being surrounded by people who know the persona but have never met you, that lifts. But life remains life. Loss still lives inside it. Confusion still visits. The ground still shifts. What changes is that you meet all of it as yourself, with your full capacity, with nothing between you and your own experience. The lows land harder because you're no longer numbing them. The joys arrive more vividly because you're no longer filtering them through a performance. Jung held this with real steadiness across his entire career. He never promised that individuation made life easier. He promised it made life realer. And he found, across decades of watching this play out in hundreds of lives, that people who had made the trade, comfort for contact, performance for presence, the familiar ache of inauthenticity for the sharper, cleaner ache of being fully exposed to their own existence, were grateful for it, even on the hard days. Even when the new chapter brought difficulties the old one never would have, because the difficulties were theirs, genuinely, completely theirs. And there's something in the human psyche that would rather face its own real problems than spend a lifetime managing borrowed ones. So here's where this lands. If you've been listening to all of this from the place I think you've been listening from, the place where something has gone quiet in your life, where the performance has become unbearable, where you're standing at the edge of something you can feel but can't fully see, then what I want you to know is simpler than everything that came before it. You're not in a crisis, you're in a crossing. And the fact that it feels indistinguishable from crisis right now is exactly what Jung observed in every person who stood where you're standing. The beginning of the best chapter always arrives wearing the clothes of the worst one. That's the disguise. That's what makes it so easy to misread. The message that found you here, through this particular stretch of your life, at this particular moment when your old chapter has gone silent and the new one hasn't yet spoken, it didn't come with guarantees. It didn't promise that the crossing would be painless, or the new chapter would be easy, or that everyone you love would understand what's happening to you. What it came with is quieter than all of that, and more important, it came with confirmation that what's happening to you is real, that the dissolution has purpose even when you can't see it, that the chapter now closing was genuine and mattered and deserves to be honored for what it gave you, and that what's waiting, the thing your psyche has been building toward through every restless night and every hollow afternoon and every ache you couldn't name, is also real, and it is patient, and it will still be there when you take the next honest step toward it. The best chapter of your life doesn't begin when things get easier. It begins when you become someone different enough to live it. And that becoming, the slow, often agonizing, entirely necessary process of it, is what's been happening to you this whole time. Every piece of it, even the parts that felt like waste, even the parts that felt like punishment, even the long stretches of nothing where it seemed like all the movement had stopped and you were just suspended in empty space. Jung wouldn't tell you it was almost over. He'd tell you that you were almost ready. And for anyone standing where you're standing, at the edge of something they can't fully see yet, holding a message they didn't ask for but recognize as true, almost ready is enough. If you're in this in-between right now, if the old chapter has gone quiet and the new one hasn't shown its face yet, and you want something to hold on to while you stand in the gap, we put together something called True Self-Discovery. 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's own way of working, built for exactly the kind of space you might be living in right now. A way to keep listening to what's trying to come through, rather than filling the silence with noise. Click below to get True Self-Discovery.